now we'll continue with Mr. Carlson, who's already there. Mr. Carlson should actually also be audible now, yeah, and should be able to start with his presentation shortly. Yeah, and I think, yeah, we can see you now. You should be able to, yeah, I think you should be able to share your screen as well now.
All right. How does it
Perfect.
look?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Very good. Good morning, good afternoon, perhaps good evening for some of you. Thanks so much for joining us today. Let me minimize here. I wanted to bring you a view on the market, specifically looking at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the autonomy sector, on the development of the technology, on the reaction from the industry, and on a couple of other areas of automotive electronics and automotive technology. I'll do my best to keep us on schedule here. And I first wanted to start by sharing the results of a survey, specifically looking at the impact of COVID-19 on research and development within the automotive industry. And this is very much geared towards some of the future technologies where there is an abundance of investment and ongoing development to make sure that we can deploy these technologies in good time. So first, at the very high level, we surveyed more than 140 companies in this survey. They together control more than $70 billion in R&D budgets in 2019. And we very simply wanted to first ask, what is your expected impact as a result of the disruption from COVID-19 on budgets going forward, both advanced R&D budgets with the longer term projects and the development budgets that are more synonymous near term with vehicle programs. This does cover OEMs and suppliers, and we'll come to that here next. At a high level, though, early on in the pandemic, we fielded this survey and found that the initial reaction is there will be some impact, and up to 17% this year, and a fairly similar number, 12% impact on long-term R&D budgets going out into 2021. When we look at nearer term projects, clearly we all understand the automotive industry and product life cycles, there's less disruption. But of course, we still expect some impact because lockdowns, quarantine measures, safer at home policies have been in effect for quite some time. And you can see that there's still a 13% budget expectation hit here in 2020, but slightly less in 2021, but still quite tangible. 8 and 12% is not negligible in this space where we really need to continue investing to make sure that we meet our deployment timelines. So when we asked about technology, specifically the deployment delays were listed as the main impact by more than half of our respondents. When we asked about specific sectors, e-mobility, EVs, batteries, all of the related technologies were among the most impacted. And actually autonomy was the second behind this with just another percentage or two drop from that 22% marker on e-mobility. Broadly, 1 in 5 of our respondents thought that the R&D impact would last longer than 12 months. And we'll see a little bit more of that on the next slide. And there were actually some respondents who expected no reduction or no delays in all of their development projects, which I think is interesting as we can see the timelines in the quarantine start to play out and the industry beginning to restart. We can kind of gauge how well some of these responses ultimately match the reality that we're seeing. Briefly on the timeline of the disruption, and I think this is what really helps us put into perspective the impact on budget and on technology deployment plans. Broadly speaking, the vast majority of our responses indicated that the duration of the impact would last somewhere between 1 and 12 months. That's a big range, of course. Almost half of our respondents said that it was going to be between 3 and 12 months. And you can see how that starts to play out when we look at the chart on the right, comparing or splitting our respondents into the supply chain and the automakers. Clearly, when we look at the number of respondents here, that 1 to 12 month window is really the sweet spot in terms of the density of responses here. You can start to see that The supply chain expects that impact to go on a little bit longer, and we think that that's more related to the advanced R&D projects and the things that are less imminent and less firm in product plans today, whereas automakers expect it to be a little bit more skewed towards the short term, which is very clearly related to their ability to manufacture and to actually get into the spaces that move their business forward. Next, I want to take a look at the regional variations here. And I think this is quite interesting as we start to take the temperature of the reaction to COVID-19 and start to see how the response from policymakers has differed in different regions, and therefore what the expected impact might be as we extrapolate out from some of these responses. In the US and North America, about 2 in 3 companies believe that the impact was going to be relatively measured, under 10% in 2021. Europe, however, more than half the respondents indicated a much stronger impact on their budgets for automotive R&D above that 10% mark. Very interesting, the Chinese companies that responded to our survey actually indicate that the fear of a long-term impact, specifically over 3 years, was substantial. And I think this reflects the state of the industry in China. We know that they move very quickly in many ways, but they're also trying to get up to speed with what the established automotive markets in the US, Europe, Japan, Korea to an extent already have in place. And I think this impact and this fear that there's a long-term consequence certainly reflects kind of the maturity of the market and the maturity of the processes that they have in place to be able to respond to this. Finally, looking at the insourcing versus outsourcing question is particularly relevant to the autonomy sector here. So we wanted to understand, in particular, splitting this out by larger companies versus medium and small sized companies, what their view was going forward. And I think this helps to orient ourselves and to understand the early perceived impact that's reflected in this data. And again, how that starts to play out over time and how that begins to address some of the fears that some of these companies may have due to the uncertainty around COVID-19. So more than half of the respondents in our survey indicated that investment in automotive startups was going to remain unchanged. A small percentage, almost 1 in 10, believe that investment in automotive startups will increase, but about a quarter believe it's going to decrease, and some actually believe that it may stop entirely for their companies. And again, this reflects to some extent the difference in sizes of suppliers within this market. Because the smaller companies have less resources, have less flexibility, especially when we talk startups here, to roll with the punches that this fiscal uncertainty really kind of brings to bear on the industry here. When we look at the right, this decision really between insourcing and outsourcing has been a repeated question for many years, and arguably for the entirety of the automotive industry, where you either want to do as much as you can yourself, but you also need partnerships. You need other technical experience that you may not already have in-house. So when we look at the large and the medium suppliers in particular, compared to the smaller companies, not just startups, but smaller companies overall, there's definitely a skewed trend towards more in-house development of many of these technologies. And this is broad automotive R&D here. Smaller companies do believe that that trend is going to remain constant. There's going to be the same amount of insourcing versus outsourcing within the industry as a result of COVID-19. And I think this really just starts to raise some concerns. We had already seen VC funding into some of the automotive startups, not necessarily slowing, but being much more deliberate, larger amounts, much more targeted. That's clearly, going to continue as the financial situation becomes much more acute for some of these companies. And that leads us to be even more concerned about many of the technology startups in this sector and whether they have the ability to survive not only a pandemic, but also this period of readjusting and really establishing more realistic expectations in terms of timeline for the deployment of our advanced technologies, especially fully autonomous driving. So next I wanted to take a close look at the impact of COVID-19 on the ADAS automated and autonomous spectrum here that covers the full extent of SAE's J3016 scale. Briefly, as a form of introduction here, IHS Markit supplies the most detailed vehicle level forecasts on both sales and production basis to the industry. And we work on top of that same data that our customers access to help build out our own view of the development of automated driving technologies, of the proliferation of ADAS, and the long-term future of fully autonomous driving. You can see on the screen here the several different ways that we quantify inputs into our forecast, and this is really what helps us kind of run through some scenarios and consider the impact of something that can be as broadly impactful as COVID-19. And to do this, I wanted to focus on two major trends here that are shaping the market for ADAS and automated driving here over the relative short term. First point is the aggressive deployment of technology and the use of ADAS and automated driving as a competitive differentiator, particularly on the part of OEMs. We have a number of automakers, especially in the volume segment, who are working to standardize a set of basic ADAS features broadly within kind of the level 0 and level 1 range. Some of these do actually span up to level 2 as well, which we'll see here in a moment. We've also, in parallel, have a wider deployment of relatively basic level 2 systems and the launch and expansion of many more level 2+ systems that we define with that driver facial monitoring camera and extended hands-off driving. We also have several flagship launches of level 3 products that we're going to see here within the next very short term, 2020 and 2021. And also this kind of adjusted expectation for level 4 and really a skewing towards either fleet or service-based business models that Richard to some extent touched on earlier. So to do this, one of the first things that my team does is we look at exactly what's available within the marketplace. Here we have 5 automakers. This is based on the US market here. I really enjoyed Sven's comments yesterday and how we substitute some of these names. I've done something very similar here with the names of fish. You can see tuna, halibut, flounder, grouper, tilapia. Similar deal as Sven, you could probably decode many of these if you try hard enough. But what we see in black text is the basic features that have been standardized. They're standard equipment in every vehicle sold, at least broadly within that model portfolio. In blue, we then have optional technologies. You can see that many of these, we've got blind spot systems, for example, which tends to be a differentiator. Flounder has standardized these, tuna, halibut, grouper have not. And then we see kind of what we're calling next generation launches, but this is broadly the level 2+ and the level 3 type system launches that are in the pipeline for many of these automakers. And you can really start to see that there's a relatively consistent offering, competitively speaking, for a lot of these basic features. Of course, there's a lot of variation in how they're enabled within the vehicle in terms of sensor content, in terms of specific functionality. But broadly speaking, there is a floor, there's a cost of entry in the US market to be able to offer a certain amount of functionality to your drivers. We do expect this to balance itself out. For example, I would expect blind spot information to be added as standard equipment to some of these packages going forward. But ultimately, the area of differentiation here and these next near-term launches really are the automated driving systems in level 2+ and level 3. So when we very broadly think about the impact here of COVID-19 on these deployments, this is my single slide. We're simplifying quite a lot of assumptions and research here, so bear with me and we can certainly dive into this in more detail offline if you like. But near-term deployments, broadly speaking, aside from vehicle production delays, aside from manufacturing restarts, the resynchronization of the supply chain, we believe that these continue as planned. product development is already largely complete, or you're facing a bigger disruption by changing your timeline and making some significant changes to your product plan in such a near-term window. Also, as a result of this, we haven't seen much material change in terms of technology or technical specifications for these systems. At lower penetration rates, though, is expected to really bring this technology into vehicles. So what we ultimately see here is a number of more price-sensitive consumers and a lot of uncertainty around consumer confidence going forward. There is a high degree of regional variability here, and we expect automakers to begin responding to that by really mixing up some of the trim and the package mixes that ultimately lead us towards less availability of these over the relative short term. We'll call it maybe the next 1 to 2 years. For some of these launches, however, there is a bright side. There's additional flexibility built into a lot of these new platforms where OTA can enable many of these features retroactively after the point of sale. That is relatively limited in the industry today, however, so the application of OTA is certainly going to be different over the next 1 to 2 years, and the automakers who have had a jump on this will certainly benefit from being able to be more agile. Briefly, at the high end of the automation spectrum, level 3 and level 4, and broadly most LiDAR-based functions here, we believe are most likely to be impacted in the midterm. The contracts and the vehicle programs that are really being defined and sourced today. Ultimately, this is due to vehicle life cycle timelines, looking at reallocating investment potentially in different platforms as a response to those changing timelines. But certainly we have renewed concerns about the viability of many of the LiDAR startups in particular, and whether they'll be able to weather this period of financial difficulty at a time where they're already not necessarily earning revenue and bolstering their cash reserves. So this added financial concern here around COVID-19 just exacerbates the concern that we had in a densely populated supplier landscape previously, and now we're just seeing additional pressure applied there. The second is looking at regulations specifically. Now, regulators have advanced a lot of mandatory ADAS options, in particular in Europe, and we'll focus on this here with the revised general safety regulation, the new type approval requirements coming over the next several years. And just a brief mention on the flip side is we've had very slow progress for the most part in enabling level 3 and level 4 regulations in most markets. I will say just today, I believe, or yesterday, the UNECE did adopt some automated lane keeping systems, part of R79, that do pave the way and create more certainty for these level 3 systems that will apply in January 2021 and will affect Europe, Japan immediately, and other countries really signing on quite quickly. But this revised general safety regulation is something that we're paying quite a lot of attention to because when we're looking at the new regulations from UNECE adopted today, we're talking about if it's automated, then you need these technologies. Whereas the revised general safety regulation applies to every new vehicle sold into Europe after 2024 for the most part. There's some variation on that timeline due to technology, but it's 2024, 2026 for every new vehicle sale. And you can see the list of features here on the left. They are quite extensive. Many of them, especially in Europe, have been quite common because they were initially a part of the Euro NCAP assessments, and that did help seed the market and help incentivize a lot of automakers to deploy that technology. But some of these features do represent some significant additional technology that wasn't previously accounted for. And really this advanced driver distraction warning and its relationship to driver drowsiness and attention warnings is one that we're watching quite closely. Thankfully, this driver, what we expect is driver facial recognition via a camera sensor. It is on a later timeline, so it would be every new type approval after 2024 and every new vehicle sold into Europe after 2026. But this represents a new technology that, yes, many automakers were already deploying, but they weren't doing it in every vehicle. And that's why this type approval update is really going to cause some substantial heartache for the industry and really force a lot of considerations around what vehicles you continue to sell over the next couple of years, how you may subsidize some of the cost of this now required technology. I will say, however, that we do have open questions to some extent around some of these technologies, and I'll highlight the advanced driver distraction warning here. We do not yet have test procedures or technical specifications, and those are not necessarily, they're not required here for several years because it's on that 2-year later timeline. There's also a footnote there in the regulation that says distraction avoidance by technical means may also be taken into consideration. We can interpret this in a lot of ways. Our current assumption is that this requires a camera sensor in the vehicle, but of course, there is some ambiguity in that, and we look forward to some of the clarification. Euro NCAP is a good indicator, though, because so many of these technologies have been included in vehicles already. There is a bit of a head start in terms of deployment by the industry, but also in terms of test procedures, tech specs, that may be able to help pave the way and solve some of these open questions here. So again, our overly simplified one-slide summary here on the assessment of the impact of COVID-19 on these new type approval regulations. Generally speaking, we expect them to continue as planned. We have quite a bit of foreshadowing already taking place in Euro NCAP. We have many technical specifications already available, and we also have sufficient time to continue developing the others. We have suppliers who are responding to the NCAP movement with minimum viable products, NCAP ready sensors that would be able to support all of these functions in a relatively easy to install package for an automaker. And simply speaking, we just have quite a few more years to continue developing, and that's backed up by really extreme difficulty, in our opinion, in revising European regulations. And I'll gladly argue with anyone about that difficulty. That said, there are certainly some considerations that we need to consider here. And this is something that we have to continue to revisit as the impacts of COVID-19 continue to play out. First of all and foremost, especially for smaller vehicles, we have to consider the difficulty that automakers face in subsidizing a relatively significant amount of cost in those smaller vehicle segments. There's also a lot of challenges in working conditions today and simply getting back to a normal workflow that allows us to keep those timelines. There's certainly an unclear economic outlook, an unclear recovery timeline, and again, we come back to consumer confidence and whether they're going to be interested in buying new cars, much less buying cars that have now a slightly higher price tag. And as important context here, the ACEA did request a 2-year delay to the 2022 Euro NCAP protocols. There's been no judgment to my knowledge on that request, but it certainly proves that there is concern from the industry and regulators will need to react to that and at least accommodate to some extent the difficulty that the industry is facing here and for the near term as COVID-19 continues to play out. So fundamentally, this is our view of the current market with some impact of the COVID-19 volume adjustments. So this is our April 2020 forecast. Since then, I will say you can look especially at the 2020 volumes here where the industry and total industry volumes have been hit quite hard. We have made further downgrades to that forecast. I believe we're around 68, 69 million units currently globally in 2020. But you can see with this transition here, we do have this very strong shock to volumes in 2020, and we do start to recover over the next several years. 2023 into 2024 is expected to kind of be that return to normal volumes. But this also occurs at a time where so many automakers are deploying level 2 systems. They're deploying a standard suite of hardware and basic ADAS features into vehicles that can then be upgraded either via OTA or otherwise into an automated driving system. And we have many more of these flagship level 2+ and level 3 launches that continue to push this higher level of automation into the industry. So I think it's interesting when we look at the evolution and coming out of this 2020 shock, that many of the level 0 and level 1 volumes remain fairly stable. They do grow to some extent as we just recuperate that volume, but this also occurs at a time where there's significant growth in level 2, and to some extent, certainly on a smaller scale, growth in level 3 as well. So it's interesting that these two happen at a time where many technologies are being pushed out into the market, and in the case of Europe, incentivized and required to be put out into the market, and to see how that kind of plays out with the recovery of volumes here. So finally, I just want to highlight quickly two other areas that our team covers, automotive semiconductors and the connected car space. So on the topic of connected car, we're again measuring the impact of COVID-19 here, and specifically looking at the launch of 5G in vehicles as a connectivity modem. So clearly there are going to be delays imminent as a result of the vehicle timeline itself, as I referenced earlier. But we've also got some additional considerations here that cause us to really adjust some of these volumes, especially over the next 1 to 2 years, and it actually only recovers several years after. This is ultimately related to many of the auctions for 5G spectrum in a lot of places that have been at least delayed or delayed indefinitely in some cases. There's clearly still a lot of interest in this, but there's just a lot of difficulty, both on the infrastructure side and on the vehicle side, to help us maintain our timelines. So you can see that we do recover those volumes. We get quite close to our base forecast in 2025, as many of these plans, essentially return or match normalcy. But clearly there's an impact, and we do expect quite a bit of a hit in 2020, not just on a volume basis, but related to all of these other industry factors as well. Next is V2X, and this covers both DSRC and cellular. We can cover that in more detail offline if you're interested, but we see a similar story. That said, this does now happen to recover those volumes on a slightly nearer term timeline, and a slight less of a shock at the very least in 2020. I'll leave this, and in the interest of time, keep going to highlight the impact on automotive semiconductors. So this is ultimately one of those comparison charts as well, but we've kind of framed this slightly differently. So the size of the bubble here and the chart on the right is the size of the overall industry, and then the vertical axis is the growth rate over the next 6 years, next 5 years, I suppose, from 19 to 25. So you can see that we do have some contraction. Some of this is just simple volume adjustments from the industry. As we recover those volumes, we will continue to grow. But because we're talking about some relatively new technologies, both in terms of e-mobility and autonomy, these are the two that are struck most strongly here by the shock of COVID-19. And just a quick mention, autonomy here does cover everything within the level 0 through level 5 spectrum. It's the entire sector. Clearly, the impact is spread out across those levels. It's different certainly at the higher end of that automation scale, but that's the biggest adjustment that we see as we start to see some pullback and some adjustment in terms of deployment timelines for some of the technology. We also, as an impact of this, especially with autonomy, we do expect that LiDAR supply chain to consolidate. There are already a number of challenges in that space, and we're already having trouble meeting some of our early deployment targets. But we expect that to be addressed by some of the companies who are able to meet those early targets, especially kind of 2022 deployment. But longer term, it's that question around startups and their survivability, and being able to match that by meeting the technical specifications that the industry requires. I think I'm actually quite close on time, and I'm probably quite over. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and say thank you very much for your attention here. We'll gladly continue the conversation offline and in Q&A here with Robin and the audience. But for now, thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you. I think time-wise that was perfect, so no worries about that. But of course, let's continue with our Q&A session. So the first question that we got was actually, which level are the major automotive OEMs currently in? ADAS, AV, can we say level 2, level 3?
I would definitely not say a level 2 and level 3. This is a lot of growth, especially, and in particular when we look at, I'll give these away, Toyota and Honda, their basic offerings, Toyota Safety Sense 2.0 and Honda Sensing, we classify those as a basic level 2 system. That's not to disparage the ability of those systems, but they are standardizing a relatively high level of automation almost across their model lineup. Some geographic variability, of course. Broadly speaking, the industry resides very firmly in this level 0 and level 1 segment. That's where we have all of our ADAS systems, our automatic emergency braking, all of the non-intervention systems like lane departure warning, as well as a lane keeping assist system that has, some form of control. So the industry very much sits in kind of that level 0, level 1 space that we call ADAS, but the growth is very much focused on that level 2 and level 3 segment, with plenty of growth as well in terms of standardization on the ADAS side.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. The other question is also, if a tier 2 also supplier company has not yet started working on ADAS AV until now, what area do you suggest should the company focus within ADAS AV?
Sure. It's a great question. We actually field it quite often. This is going to be a bit of a simple answer, but whatever you're good at is what you should be focusing on right now. Chances are, if you're already good at something, you've got some efficiencies built in, you've already got your workflows set up, it just allows you to continue doing the things that you're comfortable with. And then looking at areas right around that product set, you can start to selectively expand, your capabilities. I would say, generally speaking, I don't want to say that hardware will quickly become commoditized, because there is a lot of value still in having good hardware, but clearly a lot of the interest these days is on the software side. And I think events like this, certainly reflect that. Talking about validation of software and verification of the capabilities of your software is not only a huge challenge, but it's so populated and it's so much of a focus because it's what makes everything work. And it's one of the bigger growth segments that we see, generally speaking, because it's how you scale and expand the functionality of your vehicles.
Yeah, thank you very much also for that answer. So another question that we had got was in a different aspect in terms of the regulations. With different regulations in Europe and within the US, do you expect triple down or triple over effects?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is part of the reason why it's really interesting to be able to look at a model level forecast where we can show you exactly what feature would be on one vehicle, what sensors enable it. And because we do this on a sales basis, and then we reconcile that with our production site, we can actually start to see where some of that migration occurs. If you're only producing a vehicle in one location and you need to beat a minimum level of content, you can either add complexity to your manufacturing and your general logistics, or you can simplify that, but perhaps eat some of the cost where you would have made profit or revenue otherwise. So absolutely, I mean, this is a global economy. We expect trickle down, trickle over, spillover effects. The extent to which, however, is really, the devil's in the details, and that's where our very detailed forecast can really help us pinpoint some of those impacts.
Another one was, I think, more again on the questions before. How is the ADAS AV scene in Japan? Are they ahead in the race?
I wouldn't say that they're necessarily ahead. And I heard you said ADAS and AV, so it kind of does span quite a large segment of the SAE scale. But what a lot of the Japanese, especially the manufacturers, do quite well is they follow quite quickly, and they do it in a very strong manner. And I can't point to better examples than Toyota Safety Sense and Honda Sensing here. Certainly Nissan Safety Shield and many of the other manufacturers have a similar thing. But Toyota is a good example where they were actually late to introduce blind spots systems in their vehicles, in part because their own supply chain really couldn't support it in the same way. So they had to go external. They brought in a different supplier. They added it to a lot of vehicles very quickly. And then they've almost surpassed a lot of their competitors who might have introduced it earlier by standardizing this collection of features. And that's really one of the driving trends that helps us see the impact of these decisions around standardization. This isn't related to type approval. This isn't related to regulations or mandate necessarily. It's in preparation for some of them, but this was an early decision. It was meant, philosophically as a part of those companies. So they're also doing some interesting things in bringing their level 3 systems to market here over the next 1 to 2 years, especially Honda and Toyota, Lexus, where they are pushing for sure. They have some interesting use cases for some of their level 4 technology because of the demographics in that country. But I think everyone's got an interesting view on this, and I wouldn't quite say that anyone is necessarily leading or following at this point in a significant manner. Richard made this point earlier. To some extent, the first drive doesn't matter that much. It's about scaling up and allowing that to have a really material impact on your business.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that was it with the Q&A session. Oh, not so fast. We just got another one. Do you have any suggestions for an automotive engineer to keep learning in these tough times?
I promised you did not pay me to say this, but events like this, they're great. I mean, they bring some of the smartest people together in the room. I wish we could all be in the room together like last fall in Detroit. Unfortunately, this is the reality of our reality here. Continue talking with people, continue contributing to the industry conversations. Sven made this point as well yesterday. SAE, those types of dialogues are hugely important. I don't think that we should expect regulators to lead here. And I don't think regulators should lead, because there is a risk at inhibiting innovation if you act too quickly. So it's kind of the organic movement and coalescence of the industry around some of these key topics, and standards are a great way to help promote and join in that discussion.
Well, thank you very much again. So I would say this time, really thank you. Thank you for the extensive Q&A session as well. If you have more questions for Jeremy, I think he highlighted earlier already, feel free to reach out to him either through the app or personally. I think he will be very happy to answer all your questions or get in touch with you. Yeah, thank you very much. I'll already say goodbye to you, Jeremy. Thank you again.